Hi, we decided to do our project on the minority group of African Americans and three art pieces that they've created. So to begin, I just have some basic overview points about what Black representation looks like in art. They've been typically underrepresented through history, and typically because of racism. And because of this racism, most people don't take time to appreciate the artwork that they have created. And the majority of artists that are taught in school are white, so this leads to a systemic problem where it's not really changing, but it is starting to change, and there is a couple pieces that we found that highlight this. And it also creates an unconscious bias because the people that are seen going to art school are white, so that it becomes a typical assumption that art is a white thing. Besides that, only 1% of art in notable art museums today was created by the Black people. And some other things is that this is starting to change as people recognize underrepresented groups, and there are some events like the Black Lives Matter movement of 2020 that are bringing more light and notability to popular African Americans and the art that they may create.
Alright, our first piece is Untitled by Norman Lewis from 1957. So a little bit of back history on Norman Lewis. Norman Lewis was an American painter, scholar, and teacher born in July 1909 in the Harlem neighborhood of New York City, New York, and attended public high school number 5, where he fell in love with art. He was constantly overshadowed by his older brother and his musical talents. Lewis self-educated himself in art, and at the age of 20, Lewis traveled extensively for 3 years, worked on ocean freights, and traveled to South America and the Caribbean. Upon returning, Lewis received a job as a textile and garment press in a tailor's studio. Lewis became a member of the 306 group in 1934. This group discussed African American artists and writers to discuss their role in society. Lewis also studied at the Teachers College, Columbia University, and John Reed Club Art School. Lewis has also participated in Works Progress Administration as the art teacher in 1935. Between working at the Harlem Community Arts Center and George Washington Carver School, Lewis taught low-income families and students to love art. Lewis was associated with the abstract expressionism and focused on the Black urban life and the community struggles, abstract disillusionment, and that appeared after Lewis's World War II experiences. Many of Lewis's pieces are thought to be echoes from segregated armed forces during the wartime. Lewis quickly became interested in the abstract expressionist movement with the Irresponsibles. After moving numerous individuals such as David Smith, Ad Reinhard, Mark Tobey, and Richard Leopold. Lewis was the first generation abstract art expressionist. Untitled from 1957 allows Lewis's transition of abstract to lean towards a new approach with a blended configuration. Some spiritual art groups from 1963 to 1965, Lewis was a founding member of the Spiritual Artist Group. These artists would meet regularly to discuss the potential of Black artists to engage with issues of the racial equality and struggle in the 1960s through their work, impactful in the art world with its short existence. And to move on to the piece itself, Untitled in 1957, the piece itself has individual strokes that have glyphs, calligraph, script, miniaturized figures, as well as lots of color. Many believe that the movements created by Lewis were choreographed due to little mind dances to create stroke masses and swarms. This piece was also to evoke civil rights movement and maritime landscapes of New York and Greece.
So my piece was Walking by Charles Henry Austin in 1958. So a little bit of info on Charles. He was a Harlem Renaissance artist, and he was one of the first African-American artists to be the supervisor for the Works Progress Administration, and also the first African-American to teach at the Museum of Modern Art and the Art Students League. And he was able to do this because he did get a master's degree from Columbia College as a teacher, but he also received a bachelor's and master's from Columbia together just about art in general. Alston was not just a painter, but he was also a sculptor, muralist, teacher, and an illustrator with over 40 pieces of work altogether. And a lot of his art was actually influenced by other Mexican artists, specifically from Jose Orozco, Diego Rivera, and David Siqueiros. And he communicated with these men in French, which was their only common language, but the reason he did so was because he was drawing his ideas from them, and they were also drawing their ideas from him. And one of his famous quotes is, "I don't believe there's such a thing as black art, though there's certainly been a black experience. I've lived it, but it's also an American experience." So that really just shows that while there is black underrepresentation in art, there's also just the representation of being American in general. And about his piece Walking. So this captures the walks of the bus boycotts in the 1950s, specifically the first one, and also what the future civil rights walks would look like, especially pertaining to the later boycotts and the speech by Martin Luther King Jr. And was it the march in DC, I believe? And it depicts black women marching with a child at their side, and the women are depicted wearing long dresses, robes, aprons as well. And the figures' heads are held at a certain angle, showing pride in the cause and showing confidence in what they believe in. And the orange and red colors are symbolic to the sacrifice for freedom and equality, which is still represented today in a lot of modern black art pieces. And the green and blue colors are representing the hard work and labor that they put in.
So the last piece we got right here is Barack Obama, a self-portrait, a presidential portrait by Kehinde Wiley, and this was painted in 2017. The first, I have a couple things about Kehinde Wiley. He reinvented portrait painting. He added a modern touch to it. He doesn't generally paint what is traditionally seen as professional attire and only famous people. What he does is he bases his art on older styles, but he adds a modern touch. He was originally inspired by black underrepresentation in museums, so most of his subjects in his paintings are young black men, and then later on a few black women. And he does this to try to increase the audience of people that he wants to go to the museum, so he can see people like themselves. He chooses topics that are meant to inspire both curiosity and anxiety. It is meant to challenge certain fundamentals of the art world, while still inspiring curiosity to all that look at it. And as I was saying before, he traditionally paints with street attire versus formal suits. And even when he does have suits, like a picture of him right there, they're a little bit more creative rather than traditional one color, one piece or two piece suits. He likes to create contrast between his backgrounds and his subjects, meaning that they oftentimes aren't related. Sometimes he'll have fine traditional examples in the back with a new modern subject in front. So the piece of his that I chose was Barack Obama 2017. This are some just very, very obvious things. It has a floral background, which is obviously not something you would traditionally see in the Oval Office or in almost every other presidential picture. And it has Obama staring directly at you, but he's sitting at eye level. This means he's not necessarily looking down upon you like some other presidents may be. And him sitting down also gives him more of that sense of equality. So the foliage surrounding the subject, it both creates a 3D effect with certain leaves being in front, certain leaves behind. And another thing is he's wearing a blue suit with no tie. This is not business formal, this is more business casual as a president will get. And it also reflects Obama's shift from his presidential to his civilian life because he can't serve any more terms. So each flower in this foliage represents a different part of Obama's life. Something like the carnation represents the city of Chicago. Well, the blue lily, that represents the continent of Africa, and there's also a flower that represents his home state of Hawaii. Oh, he is purposely depicted as old here because he wants to be seen as relatable. He has his gray hair painted on, even though he might not necessarily have needed to. He does not have the wrinkles painted off his face because he wants to be seen as relatable, and he doesn't want to be seen as above other people. So another thing I also noticed was there's a lot of vibrant colors in this art, which is much different than most of the grays and browns seen in other presidential photos, and it's meant to represent ongoing change. Like dynamic colors represent the dynamic change that is going on in our world. So if you want to pause the video, here's all the sources that we used, and well, thank you for listening to our 3 pieces of art.